Good morning. How are ya? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. How are you? Okay. So good morning to South Seattle College students, faculty, and staff. For those of you who may not know, we are on the land of the Duwamish people, and I would like to give thanks for allowing us to be on this land. My name is Sol Damaris Mendez, and I'm the program coordinator for the Gender Equity Center and the Cultural Center, which are part of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Part of the work that we do at the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is student leadership and student identity development. Therefore, I have asked one of the student commissioners from the Gender Equity Center, Jennifer Yem, to come introduce and show her leadership skills by introducing our guest today. So I'd like you all to welcome Jennifer Yem.
Thank you, Sol, for the introduction, and to all who came today. I would also like to thank the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for hosting Dr. Michael Benitez, Jr. One question I would like for you all to ponder is, why is it important to have conversations on equity, diversity, and multiculturalism? I think it's important to have these conversations because due to the lack of awareness that I had before I started working at the Gender Equity Center. I am more conscious and aware of the power of language and power of media and how it portrays marginalized people. We become so focused in our perspective and that at times we need support from outside to widen our perspective. Dr. Michael Benitez, Jr. is Chief Diversity Officer and Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Puget Sound. He is both a national social justice educator and activist scholar with extensive experiences in education and campus diversity issues. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Benitez, Jr.
First off, Takahi Guatiao Duwanish Ti. So I also want to follow through in the steps of honoring the people of this land and to provide a thank for allowing us to be in this space and to share this space. So thank you much for that. It's so important that we honor that space and that we understand the history by way of where we stand and how we struggle. Secondly, I want to say thank you for having me. Can I hear it? South Seattle College, some noise? To Sol, to President Gary, who I just met, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to share this stage and to engage in the collective journey. I always like to see these journeys as a possibility and an opportunity to again, be part of a journey with people, not necessarily talking at, although colonial expectations are often that we talk at. So I will engage you from time to time. With that said, I am, as was already highlighted, the Chief Diversity Officer and the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Puget Sound. I'm also the Title IX Officer, which means that I stay really, really busy. And in that light, I also like to translate that in two ways. In one way, I like to say that I'm one of the most liked persons on campus because I get to do this incredible and wonderful work that is called diversity, inclusion, equity, multiculturalism, and be attentive to those issues, not only at the ground, but also from a structural place, because it's so important to address the power that is in there. But I like to say that secondly, in some ways, I'm also the most disliked person on campus because I am provided sort of an institutional permission to hold us accountable. That means that if we say we have a mission, that if we say we stand by a vision, that we lay out our goals, that we say we are a particular institution with a very particular identity or identities, that we follow through. So when diversity stays in this place of consumption, sensationalism, when it stays at this place of consuming diversity in a way where it becomes about people of color and other marginalized students by way of first gen, by way of folks from lower economic backgrounds, because diversity is so widespread that we can only consume, we also have to co-implicate. We have to understand our positionalities in that space and all different aspects of our identity. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, but you're gonna see that I don't read of it very much at all. I just really like to honor different learning styles. Some folks are great listeners and they're able to really kind of hone in, and some folks really prefer the visual. So I like to be able to provide that visual as well. So with that said, let's get it going, right? Here we are. How do we understand diversity leadership in 21st century America, right? The time is always now. And I say that by way of the questions that I usually get from folks. You know, when is the right time? When do I have time? We all know that we're incredibly busy, and particularly in a college with this culture, you have, I'm going to assume, a good amount of students who work quite a bit as well. Is that fair to say? Absolutely, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we understand that? How do we create balance around that? So let's get this popping. I am going to ask one thing. I'm going to ask that you allow me to be fully, authentically me. I don't know how to show up any other way. So this will be a room that I hope I can engage in a level of discomfort, not by way of agitation, but by way of renormalizing what the conversation can look like. Two very different ways of framing the issue and the discourse that is diversity. When nice meets honest, this is the Northwest, right? When I got here, folks kind of used that lingo quite a bit, right? Oh, you're going to love the Northwest. People are really, really nice. Now understand that I came, before I was here, I was in the Midwest. I was at Iowa State and then Grinnell College. And it's interesting how people are really, really nice, but then when you bring up difficult conversations, all of a sudden that niceness sort of goes away, right? So that nice has its limits. Nice is so as long as you don't make me feel a certain way. So once you start talking about race and gender and religion and other areas that challenge my dominant well-being, all of a sudden I'm not gonna be nice. But it shows up here in a different way, right? In very kind of passive-aggressive ways. Folks choose to maybe ignore you or engage in adverse racism, so not to deal with racism by way of avoiding you altogether, right? But I gotta be honest, you know, part of me really digs that passive aggression because I leverage it to say, okay, if you're not down with sort of this work and it's really bothering you so much, I'll be fine if you stay the heck out of my way as I move forward and collaboratively do this work with folks that are interested and want to do this work. That's one. Second, I learned to understand that there are two types of niceness. In the Midwest, it's more like aggressive, passive-aggressive, as I heard from a colleague at one point. But over here, folks are really nice, right? I actually learned that 2 days after I moved to Puget Sound. I was walking. I was about to cross the street. And as I get ready to cross the street, now, you know, let me mind you that it wasn't my turn to cross. You see, I'm from Puerto Rico, from New York, from PA, and then the East Coast, we don't exactly stop for people, unfortunately. So when I came here, I stood at the corner. It's not my right of way. The car was driving. Car slows down. So you know what I'm thinking. I'm like, oh man, I just started my role here 2 years ago. I can't deal with this right now. If this person says, you know, a derogatory term or screams something out the window, I'm just gonna have to hold it in. Because that's something that usually happens to people of color. And it happens to people of color literally almost on a daily basis. Right? I experience it almost on a daily basis. Right? But no, to my surprise, the car pulls up, and all I see is hands. I just kind of see this out the window. So I'm kind of watching, and I'm saying, here comes the middle finger and whatever else folks want to throw at me. But then I look closer, and I see more hand movement. Now it's looking more like So I'm like, okay, somebody's getting down, they're listening to some great vibes in the car, maybe they're slowing down because of that. But then as I kind of look closer, and as the car came closer, I noticed that the person was doing this. Like saying, go ahead, came to a complete stop, allow me to cross, and I was like, wow, the Northwest is really nice. Right? Folks are really nice. You gotta understand, for me, I've never experienced somebody just stopping to allow me to cross, or anyone to cross for that matter. But this is a big part of this culture that is the Northwest. This nice meets honest. And when nice all of a sudden turns angry or not so nice because other folks are simply engaging their honesty. This is the conversation that I have to have with my son in the reality of today's world of police brutality and violence. Now, let me be real clear with folks. I support police. I have nothing against the police, and I think that they are necessary. But I think that it is important that we address the police terrorism that we're seeing by way of the way social media has highlighted how quick they are to act against particular folks. Now, I could stand here and provide a bunch of data or videos, which I'm not too crazy about providing these videos or even sharing them, because in some ways that's like taking us back to the 1800s when they used to send postmails of lynchings from place to place, and where folks actually sensationalized in it. It was like a way of celebrating. So to me, sending videos, there's an honoring of presence, and yet there's really a disgust by way of the violence that we're putting out there, and who is on the receiving end of that violence. Out of all the recent killings that have taken place, the one that has struck me the most has to be the one down in the Carolinas, not the one where the folks have their hands up, although those are severely as bad, but the one where the officer actually stood behind a car, pointing his gun at what looked to be a black man on the ground with his hands up, and next to him was an autistic adult playing with a toy. And there was some time between the shooting that took place. Now, this person was not shot dead. It was not a fatality. But you got to think about that process, right? You got to think about sort of the colonial mentality that is passed along that allows people for 10 minutes to contemplate whether or not they're going to shoot. And what determines danger? What causes somebody to somewhat feel threatened for their life when a person is on the ground with hands up? And I think back historically, I think back to the times, particularly slavery times, when the young white male would grow up with a thirst for the whip. Cannot wait to hold that whip and know and understand what it feels like to use it, and on who. So when I think about that video, I cannot help myself but to think about that thirst, and this person taking that opportunity to finally say, I cannot let go of this opportunity to shoot a black man so I can know what it feels like. Those are the realities of our time. And yet I want to support fully police officers, because they do have a role. And I do believe that most of them are incredibly good people. And yet, those who are the majority and are good people need to do a better job calling out their peers and not standing behind them during these times. Right? The same way that they expect communities to so-called keep an eye out, do community watch alerts, and be able to communicate with police. But when things happen where now in California, a person calls for emergency because they need assistance, particularly the black man that needed assistance with mental health particularities involved, and ends up shot, it's pretty hard to contact the police officers and trust that you, especially a dark-skinned person, will not end up dead. There is the reality of intent and impact. There is the reality of how students show up to colleges today with that fear. There is the reality of students wondering what kind of college are they going to go to, and how are they supporting the students, understanding that the college in itself is a smaller piece of a broader community. You don't stay in one community, and especially in colleges like this one, where the tie-in and the integration and the connection between community and college is not all that great. The boundary is incredibly blurred. So here's again the conversation I gotta have with my son, just letting them know that unfortunately, these are the times, that unfortunately he does have to worry, that unfortunately I do prefer that he keeps his hands on the steering wheel and to just say, call my dad, than to move his hands after being asked to take out his license and registration to end up being shot. I also got to have this conversation with my daughter. I got to have the conversation with my daughter because there's this thing called heteropatriarchy. There is this thing called male privilege too. It's not only white supremacy, but the amount of sexual misconduct, sexual assaults, rape that this culture has to deal with, particularly women, though I also don't want to excuse men, and neither do I want to exclude trans people who identify in gender non-binary ways. Right? The lives. I don't have to get into this. This is our structural context today. These are the lives that have been lost. Meanwhile, we're able to tie up an alligator, a big, big alligator, just fine. And we're able to take away, at least it has shown in the media, white folks who actually do shoot at the police safely into custody. So I'm not asking for those white folks to also be shot. I'm simply asking that all are taken into custody safely. Big difference. Kaepernick. Let me be incredibly real about this particularity and the importance of this. Here we have this young man, and perhaps in his earlier years he wasn't as conscious, right? But then I think about Baldwin, and Baldwin makes some very particular claims in some of his writings, but he has this quote, and I'm not going to quote verbatim, but he talks about what it means to be a conscious black person in America. He talks about the rage that you live with each and every day by way of understanding and knowing. Then he also speaks to, and folks seldomly do not address this, the need to deal with that rage and take care of that rage so that we don't become victims to that rage. Right? That self-care. So when I think about this, I think about Kaepernick, and I think about how is he dealing with his rage. And I think about him dealing with his rage in a way where he's saying, I have nothing against this country, but I cannot stand up and salute a flag that is not doing nothing at the top to protect, particularly black folk in the United States. Now, I do want to provide some side to that, because there is also the issue beyond racism of colorism. So that really it's not about black folk in the African American sense, but anyone that appears as black. Anyone who appears as having dark skin. So we have a president who puts his hands to his heart, he pledges allegiance, he gets booed, and we have, and then we have a young man who sits and he gets booed too. But nobody is talking at all about much of the violence that is going on outside of this, that is violence inflicted by non-black folk. I address that for us to be able to give a credibility and to honor the importance of acknowledging history and how history informs today. But it's not just that. I mean, we're talking about enrollment and graduation rates, and I placed it here in a binary, but when you think about some of these reports, you know, we're talking about still a huge disparity in who's staying on college campuses and who's persisting. And on the average, dominant white are succeeding at far higher rates. And it has nothing to do with smart, though that's usually what we say. So let me ask this group right here a very serious question. And I want you all, or would like you all, to respond quickly. Do not take 5 seconds to think about it, just respond, right? Let's see what we get. Here's a story, it's my probe, then I'm gonna ask a question, and you're gonna answer, right on? I grew up in the hood. I loved school, but I didn't like it. I didn't like school because the history books sucked. They told me how worthless I was, or how invisible I was, how much I did not contribute to the fabric of this nation. Similar to what we're still seeing in Texas right now with revisionist histories. So the few occasions that I've gotten straight A's, you could imagine that I'm like amped. I'm like, word, I got me some A's. This is not a 3.92, this is a 4.0. So let me go back to my hood, let me brag a little bit, let me show my peoples that, that I'm making it. And then I go back to my community and I say this, hey, yo, homies, check this out, got straight A's, right? And after I show them that paper, they follow through with a very particular statement. They say, hey, yo, look at Mike, he's trying to be white. Amazing that I didn't have to say what I was trying to be, but really amazing how we associate intellectualism with whiteness. As if intellectualism is not a human thing. As if everybody, every single person and human being can show up brilliant, because that's what human beings are, brilliant. Now, we got to think about communities, resources, history, from slavery to Jim Crow to separate but equal, right? To redlining, to some of the legal acts that have been passed that have permitted legal exclusion to take place that grant opportunities to some and not to others. And the fact that this very practice, at least by way of not now in legal discourse, still happens. Because you don't just get rid of a history that then leads to the disparity in graduation and persistence rates that you see today by 1, preparation, 2, lack of connection, 3, inability to see oneself reflected in a campus community, so that the reality of having faculty of color is just as important as having students of color. The reality of having trans faculty is just as important as having trans students. The reality of having faculty and staff from different religious communities, such as Muslim communities, Jewish communities, Buddhist communities, and so on, is just as significant as having the students on our campus. I can and will always trust, at some level, faculty, but I always will prefer, even in ideological difference, because that's a reality, that I have someone that I don't have to explain myself for hours that can just accept what I'm telling them. So that when folks come to me, I don't have to turn on their light if they get straight A's by saying something like, oh, damn, you smart, you got straight A's, but why are you trying to be black? Or even in moving in that case to renormalize what that looks like. So if I was to ask this group right now again, here's another question. I'm going to ask it. I want you to just spit out answers. This is what renormalization looks like. Please tell me your favorite ethnic food. Go. You could be loud with it. Go ahead. Thai. What else? Tacos. What else? So we got all this ethnic food. See, when I ask the question ethnic food, when I say I'm in the mood for ethnic food, I think about burgers, hot dogs, Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, an occasional microwave dinner. So we must turn that question around and ask, what is ethnic to whom? How do we associate the normal? How do we break down the normal? Because a real democracy invites the presence, the multicultural presence in any community to ask that question. To think in what we say unconventional ways that democratically should be as normal as they come. Concentrated poverty hasn't changed very much since the 1950s and 1960s, according to the Economic Policy Institute. And this is not because folks are lazy, this is not because folks aren't trying, and this has nothing to do because folks aren't smart. This has everything to do with us yet not rectifying the economic conditions that have been created for over 250 years to 300 years, 500 if you include this cat that people call Columbus who got lost and gets celebrated like he did something. Now look, I wouldn't celebrate Columbus, and I wouldn't celebrate America's Vespucci. If y'all know the Italian explorer that is Vespucci. But if I was to celebrate a colonial day, though I prefer not to, I think I would celebrate America's, because he's who America was named after. Does that make sense? Unemployment disparities. And I want to address that in the national context of today because we see that, Obama has done, a great job, sort of bringing the unemployment rates down. But what good does that do when the pay rate is not equaling the inflation? It's not up to par with the inflation. And all these new jobs that are produced, they're needed, it's important. But who are getting these jobs and how much are they getting paid and why the heck do so many of them still live in poverty, even with a full-time job? Continued segregated schools. So here we have this trend. We have a trend where we're actually starting to see a reemergence of segregation in schools because we're not committed to our state systems, we're not committed to public schools, and we're refunneling those funds to private sectors, and we're refunneling those funds to charter schools and other schools. And so what that's doing is who lives in particular communities and has the privilege to attend these schools. Public school is damn near gone in New Orleans. Health insurance disparities. I bring this up because a lot of folks, at times, they challenge me and they say, well, Mike, it shouldn't be about race, it's really about class. So, although I slightly agree, mostly disagree with that, in the context of the US, the foundation is white supremacy by way of economic means, right? So even if the economic role was capitalism, they still commoditized the black body to do it. They still added a tag price to do that. That's very important to then understand. And that's particularly important to understand because when you break down data, when you do an analysis by class, you still find a very particular race at the bottom. Now, let's talk about this Immigration Act briefly as we get into some of the other meat. Here we have Immigration Act of 1917, right? A real law. Now, I'm going to read it verbatim by way of language to honor as an academic the language as it's written, but I also want to break it down a bit. So it banned homosexuals, idiots. That one I found interesting because that's like 3/4 of our government. Criminals, insane persons, alcoholics, all persons mentally or physically defective, polygamists, and anarchists. So that there is a connection of exclusion beyond race and gender, though race and gender are the two that were clearly at the forefront by way of who could not equally participate in a democratic system. So what is social justice? Right? When folks talk about social justice, what does it mean to address these issues? Why is it important? It's democratic, it is inclusive, it is a participatory process, right? It also represents not only diversity, but there is an equitable distribution of material resources. What good is it to have bandwidth without financial resources? What good is it to have financial resources without bandwidth? That makes structurally absolutely no sense. Now, the last one, to assure that we're physically and psychologically safe. We see in today's times that although we engage this framework, we can't always guarantee it. We see it by the shootings that are going on, which I hope folks get it together and stop thinking in such inhumane ways. But one must think about the anger on both sides, the anger by way of loss of hope and the anger by the mediocrity that has been cultivated over 500 years as a result of many people thinking that everything they got, they worked hard for and then losing it like they did in 2008. So when somebody asks me the question, yo, Mike, how the economic recession, how that impact you, it must be hard. I said, bro, man, I was born into a recession. Man, I've been in a recession all my life. Now, obviously that's a little different now, right? Puget Sound looked out and made me dean, and I do I for myself. But think about who's asking this question, who has intergenerational wealth, and who's losing by way of an economic recession because we decided to favor the 1%ers. I present this slide on structural racism, not to present it as structural racism, but to really talk about the impact that the isms have in this type of local communities. So that depending on who goes through an experience determines how they receive that experience. If you follow 10 white kids around a store, they're going to be bothered and agitated, but they're not going to think, oh, damn, they follow me because I'm white. But if you do that to non-white kids, that's exactly how they're going to take it because we have a history. That is the structural impact. To create conditions that resolve an impact by way of our history and shared culture. So who am I? Implication is another huge key to understanding how we're positioned in these issues. I went from the hood to the academy. Now, when I go back home, I have to try extra hard to reclaim my hood, but I also have to understand that I'm not there no more. So I lost some points. I'm also a First Nation Arawak Taino, but I'm also Afro-Latino. It's important that I acknowledge all those different elements of my identity. The African, the Taino, and the Spaniard, though most of our cultural practices are actually West African. Nation-state citizen. Irrespective of what's going on in Puerto Rico, though I'm really saddened by what's going on in my mainland, Puerto Ricans can just come to the US. They have citizenship, they're born with citizenship. So they don't have to worry about the struggles of being deported. They don't have to worry about what it means to cross a border, the challenges and the experiences and the harsh realities that come with that. That is a privilege. As a male in a nation that privileges maleness, I'm privileged. I'm cisgender, which means I identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth, although we are seeing right now that this is one of the biggest conversations. Not because this conversation just surfaced out of nowhere and folks just was like, oh, I'm this. It has always existed there, except we can help that the social media by way of technology has really helped things become a lot more visible. So what we see has been beneath for quite a long time. So what does it mean to be minoritized, to be marginalized, to be oppressed, or underrepresented, especially under these moments of cultural uncertainty? And then I asked the question for you to reflect on. Based on who you are, what would make a place most comfortable, an atmosphere most comfortable for you? That's part of the issue we're addressing, coexistence. To live together, to learn together, to study together, to struggle together, to co-implicate together. So when I think about critical traditions, I think about what does it mean to focus on the gaps. I think about the realities that nothing that is happening now is accidental. All of it is intentional by way of the very system that was created for it to produce, even if it didn't know that it will still be leading to what we're seeing going on today. So when you think about framing diversity leadership then, you think about it as beyond representation. So you look at this definition here, and I want to read it just by way of, it just sounds better. Social justice pedagogy and praxis, right? The teaching and learning and the applying theory to practice, through which dialogue about privilege, about power, and about difference is encouraged. It's also an ability to self-implicate yourself in a system, so that I'm Latino and I understand what that means, but I'm also a male. And I understand that intersectionality. We must look at intersectionalities as a way to eventually leading to that structural change, but let's not forget about saliency, how we show up as a way of focusing on how we change structures, how we change communities, how we make change happen. So when I think about framing diversity in the 21st century, it has to be beyond representations to include institutional processes that could cause groups and individuals to be systemically excluded from full participation, here in higher education and in other sectors and entities and mechanisms of society. It relates to understandings that benefits for some groups are really embedded already in the organizational structure and aspect of any institution. It also deals not only with characteristics, but as I mentioned, with policies, with practices, with assessment, with how we evaluate, with how we assign budgeting and allocate funding, with tenure decisions. All that must be part of the diversity conversation. It's not just about social representation. Now, let me provide a school real quick on equity and inclusion, because a lot of folks at times throw equity and inclusion around like it's just some word that applies to everything. Equity deals with access, primarily access to create equivalent or near results for groups who historically have been excluded, which also then means that we have to deal with the social restructuring of institutions, the social restructuring of who serves in certain positions. Inclusion deals with assuring that those particular folks are at the decision-making table with an equal voice to the issues, to how they show up. The exclusion or inclusion is not this. I got this from a commentary to one of the articles. As a law professor, I wonder if calling on each student individually, going down the rows so everyone gets a chance, and asking probing questions of each student about the assigned materials satisfies the requirement to include everyone. If not, then count me out. So his understanding through his dominant lens was that inclusion was about everyone. Now, inclusion is about everyone in the acritical, but inclusion is about reconciling, reckoning, rectifying a wrong. People who have been excluded to be part of that decision-making table that they have not been a part of. Everybody else, in most part, is already on that table. So here are 4 pieces as I look to close it up. So what are some of the things that we're dealing heavily in this type of community? So I could bring it down to the local. Stereotype threat. There's feelings that people create over time based on the question that I asked earlier that make them think they're not good at something. The imposter syndrome, which happens significantly among marginalized students, irrespective of where they're from. So if they're struggling racially, that's what's dealing. If they're struggling economically, that's how they're showing up. If they're first geners, they don't know how to navigate the landscape. They didn't have parents that say, hey, this is what needs to happen. They also show up with a sense of struggle. And I'm also going to add to that a significant change, which is religious representation in communities today, because though there is this thing I'm noticing in the Northwest that I call local devaluation. Local devaluation, for me, I'm at a liberal arts school. So I have, for example, evangelical Christians, traditional students who say, I'm marginalized, I'm oppressed, I'm really feeling it. What are we doing about this? And I have to have very real conversations about what is structural privilege. We're not exactly given, Muslim holidays and Jewish holidays off. But we do give Christian holidays off. Structural privilege. But there is local devaluation, so that in my case, in my institution and other liberal arts schools across the country who function in very secular ways, then their lack of perhaps wanting to acknowledge religious as a practice really start to in some ways marginalize those irrespective of religion, whether they're Christians, Muslims, Jewish, Buddhists, start to question what the heck are they doing? Why do you believe in God? And things like that, which leads to a local devaluing that also needs to be addressed. And that is what it means to think equitable and inclusively, to think about the structural and the local and to bring those pieces together. Also microaggressions, right? We get this all the time. Hey, bro, what's your name? Michael. Oh, let me tell you, man, I have one of my best friends. He's Mexican. And I'm like, I'm Puerto Rican. He's like, oh, yeah, I have some really good friends that are Puerto Rican, too. Or when I'm asked where I'm from. And many of you might relate that question becomes a multifaceted question. Where are you from? Oh, just Tacoma. But see, I don't present like I'm from Tacoma, so I'm going to get the second question, which goes, where are you really, really from? And then I address the really, really, because I'm like, all right, my bad, you must have picked up my New York accent, so I'm from the East Coast. But see, that wasn't enough, because I still look like I don't belong. So then they show up with the third question. No, Mike, so what I mean to ask is, where are you really, really, like really from? I'm like, oh, okay, I see where you want to go with this. And the same folks that then when you ask the question, where are you from, will say, oh, I'm just American, I'm white. And then you ask it again, no, where are you really, really from? They're like, oh, no, for real, I'm from here, multi-generations, my grand. And then that makes them stop. And I'm like, exactly, your grand what? And they're like, okay, so I do have an ancestry. I'm not from here, this sort of indigenous land, Turtle Island, that belongs to different tribes, none of who are Europeans, so that all Europeans have an ancestry that needs to be addressed by way of their positionality. And that positionality is what eventually has become known as whiteness. That's a really, really important piece. Now, let me be very straight here. My issue is not to knock. I don't like knocking or bashing. I really hope that we can all be in this struggle together, but folks have to show up honestly. Folks have to show up authentically. Folks have to interrogate what's privileged and what's not privileged. Then we have implicit bias. And it happens in the classroom all the time. It happens in college settings all the time. Who feels safe around who says some things that have nothing to do with anything, so that when someone comes at me and asks me about cars and baseball, I don't know what to say. But they've learned somewhere that Latinos, especially Puerto Ricans, are really good baseball players and fix cars. Or when I'm at a hotel dressed like this, and I get the occasional, excuse me, sir, can you tell service that if they can send up something to my room? Which I get, unfortunately, quite a bit. So suggestions, as I close this up now. Things that really help us. Accuracy of student names, temp with names, preferred pronouns. That's a big one in today's landscape. Trigger warnings. I'm not asking that folks say that start everything with trigger and don't create discomfort. The reality in academia is it's a community of co-exchange that allows folks to engage in that exchange. But there's a way that we engage in that exchange. There's an intellectual, respectful way that we engage in that exchange. So I do want to read a quote by Dr. Edward Langerak, who is professor emeritus at St. Olaf and is the author of Civil Disagreement, Personal Integrity, and a Pluralistic Society, to give you a sense of what civil discourse should look like. Civility is treating others with appropriate courtesy and respect. Much of what civility involves is context relative, and often it's relative mainly to what is needed for a shared task or a mutual endeavor. Then the question of what civility requires in a given context or association is related to the question of what we are trying to accomplish together. Notice that the context may well include people who are strangers and even past opponents. So we cannot rely on affection, friendship, or familiarity to set boundaries. Civility is something we intentionally bring to the situation, not necessarily something that flows from natural feelings. Notice also that civility involves patience and restraint. It has much to do with what we will not do to each other as what we will do for each other. That calls for an intentionality of respect, so that if somebody says, hey, please don't use illegal alien around me, it makes me not just uncomfortable, but that's damn near a curse word. You respect that, because you're attempting to achieve a common goal. And perhaps this person could say something like undocumented citizen. And while that's ugly in itself by way of what's really citizenship, there's a respect there. And you can still, by way of disagreement, hold on to your thoughts. Still share your thoughts, because this is academia. That we solicit anonymous feedback, irrespective of what it might produce, that we understand what personal responsibility to the public good means for institutions of higher ed, and that we foster a collaborative interaction. I'm going to get past these real quick. because I want to move to here. When I think about where we need to go, I think about duality. I think about multiplicity and polyculturalism, the work of Robin Kelley. Robin Kelley's work on polyculturalism reflects a social inheritance of culture. That means that we understand how we're learning behaviors, that we understand how we're learning culture, so that the idea that when the person, for example, sometimes I show up in the rooms and I see a person that kind of looks like me, and maybe you might experience too, and maybe we're in like a real hardcore class, and maybe I feel like saying something where I'm like, then I'm going to get jumped afterwards, or I might get jumped in class, so let me see who's around. Now I see one cat. This person looks like me. He's brown, maybe talks like me a little bit, so I make an assumption that this person's going to be down with me. So I say what I got to say. I got something to say. And I talk about, whether it's racism, whether it's classism, whether I express my sentiments. And then I look for validation. I turn to the cat next to me. I'm like, yo, right? And then I find out that this person has internalized that very culture so much that he's actually, or she's actually worse than the person that I'm contesting. That internalization is deep. Teachers as co-learners, that we understand that young students, that students in general, older students, that y'all bring a level of experience to the classroom that also contributes to what the learning looks like. That y'all bring that experience to the social cultural setting and context, and that you also contribute to that. Responsiveness to context, that we contextualize the work we do. That we don't look at things as best practices, but that we look at issues of diversity and the way we practice them as aligned practices with our missions. Vulnerability as accessibility. We show up sometimes thinking we have to be objective, positivism runs the game, when the reality is that subjectivity really matters too. Vulnerability is a great way to show each other that we're human beings. Students as empowered learners, that we engage in relation to and as active collaborators with each other. That we understand the position and location of self. That we understand that all this is nurtured, not nature. It's not nature. So when someone says, well, it's just racism, it's just the nature of it. Nothing natural about it. Sexism, nothing natural about it. Suspension of disbelief. Give me 2 minutes here and I'll wrap it up. In order to do this work, I've been engaging a lot of talk around suspension of disbelief. How many here are from theater or acting or interest in film of some sorts? Okay. So suspension in disbelief says that in order to watch a movie, you have to suspend your disbelief. If not, we will hate film. We will literally watch film and beef about it every second. Like, oh, hell no. No way. That dude fell off the bridge, landed on his feet 200 yards, then had flames lighting on his feet, and then he took off flying. That will never happen. Then we turn the TV off because we're like, this is not real. Bleep. And we don't really enjoy film. Diversity needs to be approached in that same light, so that when the marginalized person says, this is how I'm receiving life, this is how I experience life, this is my lived reality, you suspend your disbelief by way of dominant discomfort and take what they're telling you for what it is and what they're telling you, not for the way that you want to interpret it. And I talked about renormalizing, and I want to hit on mentoring up. The ability for staff and faculty in particular to see students as someone that can mentor them, that could teach them a thing or two. So I'll share a story in closing to show you how powerful engaging this behavior is. My son came, this was in Iowa, my son came to home one day. He was mad. He said, Dad, I'm so mad. Now, in Puerto Rico, we use words like papito. So I said, what's up, papito? What's going on? He said, so I was at lunch, and I was sitting, and I got pizza, and I saw that there was a slice of hair, or there was a piece of hair on my slice of pizza, and so I went back to change the slice of pizza, and the lunch lady wouldn't give me pizza. So I said, damn, that's too bad. That really sucks. You know, we'll talk to the school, see what we can do, right? He's 8. But part of me was really happy. Like, yo, my son is 8. He's talking about boycotting, right? So they're learning. Meanwhile, me and my partner, like, we just laughing to the side a little bit because this is like the cutest thing. Now, my daughter, who's 5 at the time, says to Mikey, Mikey, what's boycotting? So Mikey goes to define boycotting for her. He's like, well, Jazzy, so like boycotting is like when you don't give people your money because what they're doing is not cool. Pretty good 8-year-old definition. I'm just saying, right? Now, we're here, right, thinking, all right, so my son, he's gonna boycott. He's like, Mom, I need you, like, if you could, I really want us to just start packing my lunch, and I'm just gonna start taking my own lunch to school. So I'm like, all right, yeah, Papa, we could do that. Then my daughter comes out of left field, and she's like, Mom, I need you to start packing my lunch too. So now we're like, what's up, baby? Like, what's up, mamita? Are you going to boycott the cafeteria too? And she looked at us with this critical gaze, right? Really understanding diversity. And she stood back with this regalness. She said, no, I'm girl-cotting the cafeteria. And that's how it works. So with that said, I ask us to rupture. I ask us to break out of what is today's normality. I ask us to reimagine what a future could look like. I ask us to be the builders of what a new 21st century can look like, that is equitable, that is inclusive. You here are the teachers, and you here are the learners. So with that said, I am thankful, and I ask that you please stick around so I could take a quick picture and just put it up right now real quick, and then I'm going to, let me get it right here. And then I'm going to let y'all go. Then I'm going to say peace. So, can everybody throw a do sign up? Go ahead. Yeah, there you go. Or a fist up, that's okay too. Word. People, peace and love. Thank you.